Good morning. I'd like to welcome you all to our panel on who controls the map. My name is Kathleen Koch. I'm a former longtime CNN correspondent, author, and founder now of the nonprofit Leaders Link. We're the first organization to harness and share elected officials' disaster lessons learned to help other communities better prevent, prepare for, and recover from disasters. But let's get to the matter at hand now. Watching that video, you know, it's almost hard to remember that once upon a time, long ago, the players on the world stage were largely nation states. And where there were non-state actors, they were largely operating in the wings, on the periphery. And those on center stage, the nation states, even if they disagreed, they knew the rules, they knew their roles, they knew their lines, and life seemed so much simpler then. Of course, now we have so many violent non-state actors who are elbowing their way now, it seems, to center stage, demanding attention. And that's the phenomenon we're here to discuss. And I really want to get right to it. I have a fabulous panel. So let me get to our introductions briefly. First, our wonderful host, Rob Nicholson, Canada's Minister of National Defense, Ambassador Sandy Vershbow, Deputy Secretary General of NATO, General John Kelly, Commander of U.S. Southern Command, and Dr. Shlomo Avineri, Professor Emeritus at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Welcome, gentlemen. Minister Nicholson, I would like to go to you with the first question and really perhaps have you test the thesis. The question on the floor is, you know, are non-state actors truly increasingly controlling the map? Are they becoming more influential and important on the world stage than nation states, or are they simply becoming, you know, commanding more attention than ever before, louder than ever before?
Well, they're certainly getting more attention than ever before, and certainly their presence is increasing. Again, those of us who believe in nation states and the pluralism that can and should exist within nation states have a responsibility to ensure that these free actors, these ones who will challenge the nation state, don't get their way. And I mean, there's a number of ways we can do that. We can do it within our own borders and do it with international cooperation, but it's something that we have to do.
Dr. Avineri, I know that you have some concerns about the decreasing situation, the decreasing strength of nation states in your corner of the world, and how that is leading to the growth of the non-state violent actors. Talk to me about that.
Well, the nation-state system, as we know it, came out of Europe, mainly the Westphalian nation-state after 1648. It took 300 years until it was consolidated. But the nation-state system in the Middle East was imposed after World War I, after the victory of the Allies over the Ottoman Empire, by mainly British and French imperialism, who drew lines on the sand, the maps that we know of the Middle East, straight lines between Syria and Iraq, between Syria and Saudi Arabia, etc. Has to do with what was decided during World War I by British and French colonial imperialist officers, Sykes-Picot, the two most important people. And it took some time to unravel, and it is now unraveling, because the system imposed on the Middle East that created an independent Syria, an independent Iraq, an independent Lebanon, was basically based on the interest of the British and the French. The local population was never asked. Syria and Iraq never existed in their present borders historically. And this was done in total disregard for the wish of the local people. They were not asked whether they want to be Syrians or Iraqi. They were not asked where they want to be. And now when the system has been challenged, and it has been challenged mainly by the American occupation of Iraq and later by the Arab Spring, other identities are coming up. In cases like Syria and Iraq, people are mainly viewing themselves not only as Syrian and Iraqis, but as Shia and Sunni, Yazidis, Kurds, people who have very different histories, and those take now dominance and are bringing about the disintegration of the nation state as we know it. I think it's totally unrealistic to imagine that you can put Humpty Dumpty together again and have Syria and Iraq in their present borders as it has been since the Brits and the French decided upon it during World War I. It's a new game, and it's a new state system. It's a state system that is becoming unraveling, not just the regime.
I'd like to now go to, we have a couple of folks in the audience who are going to help us frame our discussion today, because there are so very many violent non-state actors that we can touch on and discuss. So I have a few folks who have pre-volunteered to share with me their thoughts on what you would like to see this panel cover today. So first, if you would give me your name and tell me what you want to hear about today.
Thanks, Kathleen. Peter Fahm from the Atlantic Council in Washington. And I work primarily on Africa, and certainly the state system is under challenge, as Professor Avineri said. And one of the places where it's under challenge is northeastern Nigeria with the Boko Haram insurgency. And I want to raise the question of how do we determine which of these conflicts where we have the state system under challenge, where we have non-state actors getting involved with numerous conflicts around the world, all demanding attention, what criteria are we going to use? Because if you look at the criteria to justify intervention against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, many of the same criteria are actually applicable in northeastern Nigeria. Large swaths of territory under insurgent control, large urban centers, imposition of a radical ideology, and even military capability. Boko Haram has done something that ISIS has not yet done: shoot down a fighter jet in combat operations and then beheaded the pilot. And then we have exchanges between these groups. So what are the criteria to determine when the international community needs to step in?
Thank you, Peter. And now, Muaz?
Muaz Mustafa with the Syrian Emergency Task Force. And one of the biggest threats that we do have today is ISIS, obviously. And I think my question is why don't we look at the cues that they give us? I mean, we seem to, they telegraph regularly on social media in their conversations with each other and others about that they must fight, for example, the what they call the awakening tribes in Iraq, and they must fight the Syrian apostates first, which are sort of essentially the Syrian opposition. And they regularly tell that to their fighters before they even go after Assad or Iran or Israel or the US or whatever else they have on their sort of list. At the same time, in their videos that they bring out as a message to the United States and others, they're clearly saying they're cutting off people's heads. They are eliciting a reaction. In the latest video by Baghdadi, they're calling for American troops. They're saying, stop fighting us with your proxies, but come fight us face to face. And these are very clear signals on what their fears are, which is the moderate opposition in Syria, the Sunni tribes in Iraq that have proved in the Anbar awakening in the past what they can do, that have proved in Syria and Idlib province in 6 days ISIS was destroyed. In Aleppo in 27 days they were completely decimated with negligible support from the West. And so why are we playing into their hands? I mean, we seem to be even bombing some of other Islamist extremist groups that were their enemies, thus uniting them, and we're not empowering the guys that we're that have proven their selves against ISIS in the past. So I think that's my question in general.
Thank you, Muaz. And finally, Luis.
Thank you. Good morning. Luis Rubio from SIDAC in Mexico City. General Kelly, I'd like to ask you, how do you deal with the conundrum of violence in Central America and Mexico? I see two different problems, two different sides. On the one hand, the weakness of the state institutions, the non-existent institutions in many cases, a problem of governance that lies at the core of these societies. On the other, the enormous power of the criminal organizations, which is largely based on the demand for drugs coming from the US. So prohibition for drugs, and I'm not advocating to eliminate it, but the fact is that creates enormously powerful organizations with enormous wealth that undermines the capability of those states, even if they were willing to fight those organizations. So how do you deal with that conundrum, with that clash and combination of factors?
Thank you, gentlemen. And why don't we just go right to General Kelly with that question, sir?
Well, the way to fight them, first and foremost, is to reduce the drug demand in the United States and Canada and the rest of the world. The amount of money that is generated by drug consumption, primarily in the West, fuels unbelievable levels of violence throughout the world, but certainly in your country, in Central America and other parts of the Americas, the Caribbean. Just cocaine alone, the profit that comes out of the United States, cocaine alone is about $80 billion a year. The problems with the cartels is not getting drugs into the United States. The problem is laundering the money. I mean, when my organization seizes money, we don't count it, we weigh it. We turn it over to people. I mean, think of a ton of money and no coins. It's a phenomenal amount of money. The way you do it, sir, is what we helped take place in Colombia. Colombia 15 or 20 years ago was nearly a failed state. Certainly as bad off as some of the nations that you've referenced. And mostly through their own efforts, almost entirely through their own funding, they had to make very, very hard decisions about their society, about their tax code, about including people into the fight, improving their military, particularly not only effectiveness on the battlefield, but in the realm of human rights, bringing government institutions out into the countryside where there never was any. The school solution, if you will, is what Colombia did. The United States assisted with a lot of advice, a lot of encouragement, very, very, very little money, 4 cents on the dollar. All the rest of it was paid for by the Colombians, but they had to make a commitment. And today,
so that's the example of what works.
right, and we've asked, and they do it. The Colombians are now exporting their experiences. They're working with other countries up the Central American Isthmus, in other parts of the Caribbean, working with them not only in reforming their military, but also in working with their governments, telling them these are the things you have to do, tax code wise, again, get the elites involved, all of the things that we learned in Colombia. I can't say enough about what Colombia did for itself and is now doing for other parts of the region.
We have to go beyond that as well. I mean, you need those nation states to cooperate with each other to resist, to tackle these things that happen to us. And again, with Operation Carib, Operation Martillo is an example of nation states coming together, working to stop these drug cartels. And Canada, which is a creation of French and British imperialism, has an important role to play in that. And assisting, and then that's exactly what we do. We join in these operations because we know that these problems end up on our doorstep if we don't do it. So yes, we want to work with the countries to make sure they have the institutions in place to resist, to fight this type of activity, but it's vital for us as nation states to work together to assist.
And is it the drug cartels, General Kelly, that are your greatest concern when it comes to violent non-state actors in the 45 nations and territories in your area of operation?
Yeah, I mean, without doubt. I mean, these cartels, most people don't understand the size, the complexity, and the reach. I mean, they're joined, by the way, to the rest of the world transnational organized crime network. I mean, this is a worldwide thing. There is terrorism being financed around the world to some degree by cocaine consumption in Canada, the United States, Western Europe. It's kind of a really horrible irony. But yeah, I mean, these are think multinational corporations. They grow it, they transport it, and they market it in the United States, in Beijing, in Auckland, in all over Western Europe, anywhere where they can sell it. It's an amazing organization. The big ones are the Mexican ones, but it's at the same time very large, but very decentralized as well.
Ambassador Vershbow, I'd like to get to you now. We will get to Boko Haram and we will talk about ISIS, but I want to talk about Ukraine. I know Vice President Joe Biden just left there this week, and he called these Russian separatist proxies of Russia. The Ukrainian Prime Minister this week called them Russian mercenaries, refused to negotiate with them. So where do they fall? Do we label them as separatists? I mean, as non-violent, as violent non-state actors?
Yeah.
Or are they an extension of the state?
Well, it's a very ambiguous situation, and deliberately so. This is sort of the underlying goal, I think, of President Putin and what he's doing in eastern Ukraine. He's trying to have it both ways in some respects. And Russia still enjoys the status of a state. It enjoys the benefits of the international system. But at the same time, it's using non-state actors to actively destabilize a neighboring country. And we see that this is what we're calling now hybrid warfare, and you could perhaps say these are hybrid non-state actors. There's an official dimension to it, but some of them are Cossacks and volunteers or soldiers on vacation or people who kind of got lost and sort of decided to join the fight, but nothing to do with Russia. And of course, the aim is to have deniability, although it's getting increasingly implausible. But this is a kind of a new challenge, and I think this could be applied not just by Russia, but by others in other parts of Europe and the rest of the world.
But are we adequately meeting the challenge? Dr. Aveniri?
If I may refer to the first question about criteria, I'm going to say something which is very not politically correct. There is no one-size-fits-all. We have to understand whether it is in Iraqi Kurdistan or whether it is in Ukraine, Russia, the history of what brought about the crisis. I mean, the crisis in Eastern Europe, I don't want to go into it in great detail, has to do with the fact that the borders of Russia and Ukraine were an outcome of communist Soviet policy in the early mid-19th, 20th century. And those became now the borders of independent states. And this has left a lot of minorities. I'm not justifying anything which is done by Putin or Russia, but there is a background to it. And the same in the Middle East. A few months ago, everybody was talking about the terrible things that are happening to the Yazidis in northeast Syria and also in Iraq. Who has ever heard outside the region about the Yazidis? And everybody didn't understand there is a historical problem there that has to be looked at. So I think there is no one criterion. The only advice one can give, I think, to policymakers is before you make decisions, whether it is of intervention or non-intervention, whether looking for your allies or trying to define your enemy, know a little bit about the history of the region, whether it is the history of the Kurdish national movement that has been frustrated for decades. It's not just the issue now, it has a history, whether it is the relations between Sunni and Shias, whether it is the history of the Alawite minority in Syria, how come that they became the dominant political force in Syria, and we find sometimes a lot of ignorance about those backgrounds, and therefore some of the decisions are then catastrophic.
Yeah. But in the case of Europe, we've developed not just since the end of the Cold War, but since the end of World War II, a rule-based international system, which Russia has very much, and the Soviet Union before it, has very much been a key stakeholder. In fact, the whole Helsinki Final Act was the result of a Russian push for an international treaty that would codify existing borders and codify the principle that borders should not be changed by force. And at the end of the Soviet Union, Russia signed a treaty at Belovezhskaya that basically said that they would accept the internal borders of the USSR as international borders. So Russia has now systematically destroyed its own legal framework that it itself helped to create. And let's not forget the Budapest Memorandum in which they got this great deal.
So what do we do about that?
I don't disagree. But the point is that the disintegration of the Soviet Union into 15 nation states is something that was not part of an international agreement, but part of an internal development in Russia. We know that the United States was very much at one time against the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And then you accept it as a fait accompli. I mean, there are developments here that you have to take into account, which doesn't justify violent actions coming from Moscow.
Does NATO need to be doing more?
Okay.
Does NATO need to be doing more in Ukraine?
Well, we're already doing a lot in terms of trying to help strengthen Ukraine, and NATO is only one actor in this regard. The European Union is deeply involved. The U.S. is deeply involved, trying to help them strengthen their state so that they're less vulnerable to this sort of interference by Russia. We're assisting them in rebuilding their security forces, although NATO doesn't get into the issue of lethal versus non-lethal. That's decided by nations. But nevertheless, we're trying to help them be able to defend their sovereignty, because that's what's at stake here. And if Ukraine can't preserve its sovereignty, other states are even more vulnerable than ever. But let's also not forget that this isn't about ethnic compatriots, even though that's been used as the justification by President Putin in his quite remarkable and hair-raising speech of March the 18th about the Russian world. It's all about preventing democratization and a pro-European orientation from taking root in a neighboring state of the USSR, of Russia. Freudian slip, but it's actually apropos.
Good old days.
And it's driven in turn by Russian domestic politics. Putin doesn't want a Maidan in Russia, and so he's going to eliminate any chance of a successful popular rebellion against corrupt kleptocracy in Ukraine.
Minister Nicholson, General Kelly, anyone want to weigh in on this?
Well, again, as one of the nation states that are part of NATO, we're firmly committed to the Operation Reassurance to do what we can to send out the message that this is completely unacceptable. And going back to the
Doesn't
first...
sound like Putin's getting the message.
Well, you know, with the sanctions in place and the economic sanctions that are taking place and the international outrage of them, it's certainly my hope and the hope of everyone that he does get the message, because we are not going to let up on this. This is a continuous effort on behalf of Canada and like-minded countries to insist, whether it takes 5 years or 50, the people of Ukraine deserve the freedom that they deserve, that they fought for, that they achieved, and that has to be one of our goals.
Well done.
Dr. Avineri, I'd like to go back to Boko Haram because you brought that up. And in commenting on the issue Peter raised, you say, oh, this criteria can't apply in the same way in every country. It's interesting that your Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, has described Boko Haram in the same breath as ISIS and Hamas and Hezbollah, calling them branches of the same poisonous tree. And Israel has actually been instrumental in training the most effective military unit in Cameroon that is really basically the only unit in the region that has been taking on and defeating Boko Haram. So what are your thoughts on that? Do we need more aid in that respect to help in these regions?
Well, you put me a little bit in an uncomfortable position because I'm not only a political scientist, but also I'm a citizen, and I occasionally vote in Israeli elections. And I'm not going to tell you for whom I voted because it's none of your business. But let me tell you, I did not vote for Netanyahu, okay? So having said that, I think what you point out suggests something which may be also of interest in the fighting ISIS. That perhaps the only way of winning the war against non-conventional asymmetrical players is by asymmetrical action on the part of the nation states of the West. I'm not only, and we have good examples or bad examples. The Soviet Union, with all its might, wasn't able to overcome the Afghanistan situation. And the United States has problems in Afghanistan and Iraq even now. And the answer is perhaps to adopt some of the tactics which are being used by the non-conventional and asymmetrical forces. And perhaps in this respect, the Peshmerga, which are on the borderline of a non-conventional former guerrilla group and a infantry group, can perhaps have a better chance of doing it than even a reconstituted Iraqi army, which is then doing it in a very bureaucratic and state-organized army. So one has to look very carefully at what are the counter-insurgency or counter measures, and to look at non-conventional asymmetrical ways, and whether what you have said is the answer to Boko Haram or not, I do not know, because I'm not aware too much of the Nigerian situation, but one has to look seriously at non-conventional answers. Bombing from above and conventional warfare is not going to be the answer.
I think that takes us to ISIS. And General Kelly, before we start discussing the best way to address ISIS and how things are going up to this point, I would like to look backwards a little bit. And you spent a good bit of time in Iraq, and from the research that journalists and others have done, they believe that ISIL had its inception in Camp Bucca, a prison camp where 8 of the leaders of ISIL were incarcerated together there for numerous years. I'm wondering, for the time that you spent in the region, did you see this coming? The disenfranchisement of the Sunnis, and again, this metastasizing of these groups in prisons.
So, not in prisons. I mean, these movements began, years ago. We all know the history, and it will continue to expand and morph, and for probably, I think, decades and decades to come. I mean, this is a very, very long war. I mean, and no one in this room, in my opinion, will be alive at the end of this war, and we will win it so long as we stay true to our values and in like-minded, decent people gather together and do what needs to be done. So I don't think it necessarily. I mean, the fact that they happen to be in the same place at the same time.
Coincidence.
It just to the point that was made here a few minutes ago, I mean, one of the things we're most successful, I think, when we train, and again, the Colombian example or the Sunni awakening example in Anbar province, when you work by, with, and through the local people and trust them and get to know them, put your arms around them. It takes time. But when I was first sent to Anbar province, the advice Paul Bremer and Rick Sanchez gave me was, you're going to the worst part of Iraq. You will never win down there. Just don't get too many people killed. I would tell you within 5 years, the forces that were there, all of the forces that were there, handed a win. And we handed the political leadership a win by, as I say, engaging with the religious people, with the women's groups, literally with many women's groups, with the tribal leaders, the clan leaders.
So you handed them the win and they lost the win?
Yes. We won, and we handed that win off. And that obviously, one of the great regrets of my career is the very people that I told when I left, the sheikhs and the local, the mayor of Fallujah and the mayor of Ramadi and the mayor of Qaim and the imams. When I left, I said, stay focused on being citizens of Iraq. Over time, an Iraqi good enough democracy will develop. That democracy, in my view, had to include the imams and the tribal leaders in some way, but stay true to them, and we won't walk away from you. It broke my heart about a week ago to see about 300 tribesmen from out in the Heat area, just machine gunned, and these are people I knew and trusted, and it breaks my heart that we walked away. Now, we're back in, and with a little bit of hope, we'll make this thing work.
Minister Nicholson, I wanted to give you the opportunity to respond. ISIL yesterday came out and said that they believe that they were the inspiration for the attacks on 2 members of your Canadian military, the murders of them last month. They said because they made the pronouncement worldwide, anyone who is joining in this coalition with the United States to fight ISIL, go after them and kill them. Do you have any thoughts?
Again, I don't know if that has been officially confirmed, but nonetheless, this was a couple of terrible tragedies that took place here in Canada, and I have been saying that how grateful we are for the support and the condolences that we've received throughout the world. But it reinforces our resolve to tackle ISIL at home and abroad. And again, it goes back to what this conference here is all about, or this panel is, that nation states have to bind together to challenge these. And going back to that first question, where do we strike? Where do we come together? I think there has to be a recognition that not one country can do it all on their own. It's not enough for the United States to do this, to tackle all these problems. We need all like-minded nation states to realize that we all have a stake in fighting, whether it's ISIL or drug cartels or something. These individuals are the same. They are immoral, they respect no laws, and they are dangerous. And so we all have that responsibility. And let me just finish that by saying, you can ask me who I voted for anytime, Kathleen. I just want that to be part of the record here.
May I just make 2 points? First of all, I think one of the most successful Western strategies has been using drone strikes, which are in a way on the border of asymmetrical war, because it's not, you're not fighting an enemy in the traditional confrontational way. And this has been successful with a lot of problems, both in Pakistan but also in Yemen. One shouldn't really minimize the way that sometimes the West, and rightly so, is adopting those strategies, and I'd like to see more. I'd like to see more of it. Secondly, because Gaza was mentioned in the earlier session, I want just to make a footnote as an Israeli. Israel as a nation state was fighting an organization, whether you call it terrorist or not, doesn't matter, was fighting an organization that was not fighting or playing by the rules of international law. So therefore, those of you and those of us who are concerned about what's happening in Canada or what's happening in Britain or 9/11 in the United States have to understand that Hamas in Gaza is not exactly the same, but they are first cousins of the same phenomenon. It's a non-state organization that shields itself behind women and children, occasionally behind international law, which it itself is not committed to. So this is one of the problems for Israel is suffering from. I'm not saying that everything that Israel is doing is right. A lot of it is not. But we are witnessing the same problem in our case. The fact that behind it there's a Palestinian national movement and the Palestinians have a right to self-determination, I have no problem about that. But Hamas is a non-state actor and it should be viewed in the world just as other non-state actors. It's not identical with Boko Haram, it's not identical with ISIS, but those are cousins in the same family and we have to understand that.
Ambassador Verschaft.
Yeah. I'd like to come back to the issue of how do we fight ISIS or ISIL as we call it. And I think the essential part of the strategy that is being pursued now against ISIL, and I think is applicable in other cases, including vis-a-vis Boko Haram, is the importance of the local forces. We've tried the outside intervention, imposing a solution from outside. We kind of salvaged the situation in Iraq, but it didn't work out so well. And basically, we don't have the resources to intervene in large scale in any case. But I think also the viability of a solution is to build up local forces who can fight for their own countries, fight for their own more moderate ideologies to counter the toxic ideology of groups like ISIL. And also building up institutions of local governance. Inclusiveness was the failure of the Maliki government. It wasn't that the tribes lost their way, it was that the government in Baghdad excluded the Sunnis progressively from participating in the Iraqi state, and it made the parts of Iraq fertile ground for ISIL's message. And so we have to work with the local forces, and this is where the international community can help. And NATO is looking to expand its role in defense capacity building, helping countries build stronger defense institutions and military capabilities, counter-terrorist capabilities, so they can do the leading part of the fighting themselves. We can support them. In the case of ISIL, it's so serious that we have to use kinetic action from the air to beat them back. But the longer-term solution is building up the local institutions that can defeat them on the ground, and also getting the states of the region to be the key parts of any external military intervention. So it doesn't have this same image of Western crusade against Islam that we suffered in Iraq.
Actually, I'd like to throw out one question before we do go to the audience in just a minute. I thought it was very interesting what former Israeli Prime Minister and Defense Minister Ehud Barak said yesterday, that if we eradicate ISIL, who wins? And he said who wins is Assad, Iran, and Hezbollah. Thoughts?
It's really one of the problems. Because there is a view that usually wars are between the good guys and the bad guys. What do you do when the war is between the bad guys and the bad guys? Who are the bad guys you'd like?
Who do you help?
You'd like to support? And I think Ehud Barak put yesterday the dilemma very clearly, and one should be aware of it. I'm not sure there is an easy answer to it, but there is something else here which we should bear in mind. And here is what I want to agree with the ambassador. I'm not a Huntingtonian, and I think to understand what's happening now in Huntingtonian terms is wrong. This is not a clash of civilization. It's not a clash between the West and Islam. This is an internal civil war within Islam between moderate, accommodating Muslims who are very deeply religious, very devout, read from the same Quranic text, and a very extreme interpretation of Islam. I'm not the one to say which is the right interpretation. I'll leave it to them. But the war will be won, if it's going to be won, with Western help, but it will be won by moderate Muslims against extremist Muslims. And this is why Saudi Arabia, which is not exactly a moderate Islamic country, but it is a nation state with responsibility, with deep links to the West, with also sometimes links even with Israel. The key is in the hand of the Muslim nation, the Ummah, whether it wants to fight the extremists within their own camp or just give up. And I'm very much encouraged by the fact that the coalition today is not just a coalition of Westerners against Muslim extremists, but the major issue and the major allies are the most moderate Muslim countries. Some of them are problematic. I mean, the regime in Egypt is problematic. But considering the alternative, it is the sort of thing which has a chance of bringing a legitimate Islamic government, which is not exactly democratic, not exactly liberal, but it is fighting its own civil war against Islamic radicals, and I think this is one should bear in mind. It's not an Huntingtonian war.
Thank you, Dr. Raveneri. And now I would love to go to questions from the audience, and actually, I have a mic, so I'll bring it to myself.
Hi, Peter McKay, Canada. Just to come back to, I think, an important question asked by our moderator, and that is NATO's ability to take preventative protective action here. The Membership Action Program plan some years ago could have included Ukraine. It could have included Georgia. It could have included and should include Montenegro. This protective shield provided by Article 5 has been effective when one considers the Baltic states, when one considers the role that NATO has played and continues to play in terms of training and helping countries to prepare and defend themselves. There is a very impressive deterrent message that comes from membership in this exclusive alliance. The only time it's really been penetrated was 9/11, and that wasn't from a state actor. And so I guess the question in retrospect, but more importantly looking forward, is shouldn't we look to expand NATO? It's been some years. Shouldn't we take a more open view? We talk about open door. There seems to be an invisible shield over that door right now, and I'm interested in your thoughts on that, Mr. Vershbow.
Well, I'm a strong partisan for NATO enlargement, and I still believe we have to uphold that vision and not be intimidated by Russian efforts to draw red lines and to reestablish a sphere of influence in their neighborhood. The Membership Action Plan, of course, isn't the same as Article 5. It would have put Ukraine and Georgia on a more clear path. It's not necessarily the case that it would have made a fundamental difference in what we've seen in the last 9-10 months. Sadly, what this crisis has underscored is the sharp difference between being a member of NATO when you get Article 5 and you get the protection, which is now being strengthened, by the way, with another action plan, the Readiness Action Plan, the RAP, so that we can be more agile, more able to respond very quickly to both conventional and hybrid threats that might come, particularly in the eastern part of the alliance, particularly up in the Baltics. But no one was prepared to go to war for Ukraine in the spring when the little green men began to occupy Crimea. But I think that we have to both stay true to our vision for the countries that still pursue membership, and that includes Georgia, includes 3 of the Western Balkan countries. And ultimately, the way to show that the door is really open is by letting somebody in. I think the next opportunity to take such a decision is at the end of next year, when we're going to have a sort of intensive review of Montenegro's candidacy. They kind of came close, but not quite close enough for this last summit in Wales. But we also have a substantial package to help the Georgians get further down the road towards membership. And that's going to be a very divisive issue when the debate comes, whether it's at the next NATO summit in 2016 or the one after. But we cannot be true to our principles if we allow the Russians to basically bully us into abandoning the open door.
Okay. Dr. Raveneri, briefly.
Yeah, I don't want to sound critical of NATO because some of my best friends are in NATO, so I should be very careful. But to answer Minister McKay's question, to my mind, the future of the relationship with Ukraine has to do with whether Ukraine is capable to create a coherent political structure. Ukraine has not exactly been a failed state, but in the last 25 years it was not really very successful in creating a coherent, non-corrupt, and integrated state system. And to my mind, what NATO can do, and it has been very successful in the case of Georgia, is to help Ukraine create a coherent state system with a bureaucracy, with an army. One of the reasons that corruption is so rampant in Ukraine is because the state structure has been politicized, has been not very effective, and this is a great challenge. It has to be done with Ukrainians. It cannot be done from outside, but one has to find the kind of people in Ukraine who can do it. Until now, most of the leaders of Ukraine has not been very helpful. Perhaps Poroshenko will be more successful than others.
No, I totally agree, and the issue of NATO membership is being debated now in Ukraine. At the moment, they still have a non-aligned policy. If they change that, we will defend their right to pursue NATO membership, but the issue isn't really ripe for any decision making. They first have to get their act together in terms of the building a viable state. based on the rule of law, and that's where the European Union has a big role to play. And that's precisely what Putin is trying to prevent. He doesn't want them to succeed, and he will actively try to subvert their efforts. And the West has to be extremely determined and committed and ready to commit serious resources to help Ukraine succeed. But they have to make the fundamental decisions themselves.
Right. We have a question right here. And if you would introduce yourself, please.
John Vinokur, Wall Street Journal. I'd like to ask Sandy Vershbow, John Kelly, a question concerning a statement by Vice President Biden last night. He said, he used the word unacceptable to describe Russian military activity in Ukraine currently. I once asked Richard Holbrooke what unacceptable meant in our time, and he said there's only one meaning for it in diplomatic history. It means this shall not stand. I'd like to ask NATO and General Kelly, what does unacceptable mean today when at the same time the United States announced its contribution to Ukraine this week is ready-to-eat meals, Spam?
Okay. Certainly what Russia has been doing I think meets the test of unacceptable in the sense of violating the sovereignty of Ukraine, using the cover of these so-called separatists to de facto create another frozen conflict in a portion of Ukraine. And all these things are flagrant violations of UN resolutions defining aggression and umpteen agreements that Russia itself has, over the years, stood by. Now, our response doesn't have to be instantaneous, but we have to continue to impose higher and higher costs on Russia for its aggression. The key instrument the international community has come up with, and they're working, are the sanctions. We have to do what we can to strengthen Ukraine and help make it more resistant to this kind of interference. We have to abide by a long-term non-recognition policy towards Crimea. We can't forget Crimea just because Eastern Ukraine is the part that's now in flames. Because if they get away with annexing part of a sovereign state in post-Cold War Europe, the whole basis for stability and security is at risk. I think we'll have to see what more we can do to strengthen Ukraine, and it's not just NATO's responsibility because the key challenges they face are political, economic, institutional, rooting out corruption, carrying out the fundamental reforms, coming up with a more rational energy policy so they're less dependent on the Russians for gas. There's a huge list of things that they need to do, and we have to help them as much as possible. So this shall not stand doesn't mean it's going to be dealt with tomorrow, but we have to be in this for the long haul, stay committed to our principles, put some real resources behind our policy, and I think ultimately Russia's hand will get weaker over time, and we'll be able to begin to roll back some of what we've seen.
And my comment would be simply, and I certainly agree with everything the ambassador said, we have to take a long view of this. You know, as a military man, I'll do exactly what I'm told to do. Right now, I don't think we should do anything but take the long view, sanctions, and just wait this thing out. I mean, obviously, there'd be a point, I guess, if the leadership in Russia were to really push this thing to a really irrational level. That'd be a different story altogether. But at the end of the day, I think probably right now it's best to watch and wait. But again, as a military man, I don't make policy. I just execute it, and we'll do what we're told to do.
Thank you, sir. Question here.
Pippa Malmgren, former advisor to President George W. Bush and now advisor to global investors. As an economist, I wanted to ask you about the alignment between states and their sovereign commercial entities, organized crime, and the intelligence services, where we see governments seeking to arm people with $100, have them cross a border, and buy a lot of assets and a lot of loyalty. This is a particular issue in a world economy that is weak. And to General Kelly's point that money laundering and the revenue generation is not just from drug trafficking, but also from trafficking in counterfeit luxury goods, where the rates of return on capital are much higher these days. So they're behaving in a very rational manner and turning to things that actually pay faster. So this is an important question because the border can move without any military event with what I've described. So I'm interested in your views on this.
Was it directed to General Kelly or? Okay, thank you.
Well, the transnational organized criminal organizations in the world are massive global businesses, and they'll make money, in any way they can. But I would tell you the big money is in drugs. But just as we saw last summer with the unaccompanied alien children, 68,000 that came up mostly from Central America. I mean, the network that I deal with and that we have really good clarity on in terms of how it operates, the networks saw an opportunity and jumped on it. In fact, there was discussions within the network as to whether they were moving too many children, because that's not where the real money was, and it was getting in the way of moving cocaine and heroin and methamphetamine. So they started to adjust the flow internally so that they wouldn't lose out on the big money, and that is the flow of drugs. But you're right. I mean, luxury goods and all sorts of exotic animals and all that. All of this moves on this international network. All you have to do is and people and sex slaves, and all you have to do is pay the fare, and you've got a free ride. In the network I deal with, a free ride into the United States for a kind of a minimal amount of money.
Minister Nicholson.
Yes, I mean, we have to come to grips with the reality of what we are dealing with. The globalization of all these different types of crime is a factor that we have to deal with. And those of us, us nation states, have to ensure that, number one, we have that global cooperation with those like-minded individuals and countries, and to ensure that our laws keep pace with what's actually happening in this world. I mean, 30 years ago, if you looked at the laws in Canada, there's quite a few descriptions of using the postal service for crime. Well, we've moved beyond that. The criminals in this country no longer send telegrams to each other. They've gone beyond that, and our laws have to reflect that kind of reality. And the reality that, again, the crime respects no borders, and we have to deal with that. And I believe that we are dealing with that. There's greater international cooperation. I was recently using the example of a child porn bust, and people were arrested in about 5 different countries. Well, that wasn't just a coincidence. I mean, that was the kind of cooperation that is now taking place between nation states that has to happen, because these crimes aren't just localized and committed in one country, or they do go cross borders. And so I'm encouraged by the greater cooperation that now exists between like-minded nation states. And again, we all have this challenge to make sure our laws reflect as to what's happening out there, and that we are properly responding to them.
Okay, we have a question here.
Tolu Ogunlesi from Nigeria, West Africa editor for the Africa Report. For many years until this year, Boko Haram was a shadowy insurgent group, coming out of hideouts for bombing attacks and shooting attacks. This year, it started to transform into an invading army. Similar to what you're seeing with ISIL. Is the future perhaps non-state actors attempting to become state actors, setting up governments, as we've seen with Boko Haram, for example, and knowing how adaptive they are?
Offering services, offering security.
Offering services and welfare schemes and all that, and knowing how adaptive they are, is there a possibility that they might become a bit more benign and attempt to invent themselves as governments? Is that how much of a possibility?
And how could we make that happen? Interesting question. Who wants to take that? Okay.
I'm glad the question was raised, and here I want to convince where I was wrong. At one time, there were people in Israel who thought that once Hamas becomes part of the government or controls Gaza, it will be responsible. It will behave like a nation state. In some cases, it may happen. But again, it's not a deterministic system. It's not linear. It can happen in some cases. It can happen in some other cases. And I'm not sure about Boko Haram specifically, but I don't want to rule this out. But the fact is that until now, the experience we have had, especially in the Middle East, of organizations which were non-state organizations beginning to control territory, it doesn't make them immediately responsible. One more point about ISIS. We have all seen, and Ehud Barak mentioned it yesterday very dramatically, how the beheadings have shocked the West. But the beheadings have also motivated a lot of young people in the Middle East to join ISIS. And we should be aware of that, because people who have lost their identity as Syrians or Iraqis or Lebanese or whatever, see it as an expression of power. And I'm against censorship, but I would suggest that we very seriously think, those of us who are responsible for mass communication, every time you show again and again the beheadings, it may shock people in the West to action, but it may also motivate people in the Middle East to join ISIS. One should be at least aware of this. No
giving
censorship,
them what they want.
but, one should be aware of it. The same about Boko Haram. What to us is shocking, to a lot of people on the other side of the hill, is an issue of pride, of power, and the fact that the West doesn't always succeed in countering those atrocities just underlines and strengthens the motivation among some young people, deracinated, alienated, poor, feeling outside of society, to join something which is so very, very dramatic. At least we should be aware of them.
And I would offer their real advantage is to stay asymmetric. Once they start to conventionalize, if you will, then they set themselves up for targeting. So I think so long as they stay shadowy and do what they're doing, they're a lot harder to get to, particularly if there's not a commitment to put boots on the ground, as the expression goes. But if they start to conventionalize, and I agree, just because they take over a bit of territory doesn't mean they're going to turn into good guys and gals. But as they start to come together, hold terrain, we can find them and we can fix them and we can take care of business. But so if I was their military advisor, I'd tell them stay asymmetric.
That's why some of them don't do it, precisely because of this reason.
Right. I mean, even with ISIS now, we knew we'd have some initial successes because we were watching how they operated. And then as we started to apply force against them, this whole thing, warfare is first and foremost an intellectual activity, and you learn from the people you're fighting, or it's chess, it's whatever. So we had some initial successes because we knew how they were operating. Once we started to apply force, they then understood what our capabilities were to get to them, and they started to disperse and get shadowy, and
they adapt.
They adapt, and that's what I think. That's what Dave was saying a little earlier. It's all about adapting to each other over time. It's first and foremost, it's intellectual. It's not force.
And we have a question right here.
Georgian Institute for Strategic Studies. If we look of what Russia has been doing for decades in our part of the world, it's a pattern that Russia uses very systemically, using non-state actors as the proxies and actions of those being clearly attributable to Russia as a state. So why ambiguity is still part of an equation? Are the actions ambiguous enough to be really clearly defined, or it's just convenient to keep them ambiguous enough because there's no strategy on what to do about it? And is it the high time with this big war in Ukraine right now to bring clarity to the situation? NATO is stepping up, and then we see much more clarity from the side of the NATO in terms of intelligence information and Russia's actions on the ground. And that's a progress if we compare it to what has been happening in 2008 and afterwards. So part of the strategy, should the clarity be part of it in the way that deniability is not the tool that Russia could use anymore? And why are we still shying away from helping state actors to step up and then be defensible with their own efforts more, so that we build up their defense capabilities when Russia is doing everything to make sure that non-state actors have all the tools they need to destabilize the state actors in this asymmetrical hybrid warfare that we're in Eastern Europe right now?
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think on the latter part of your question, we are trying to do that and to help build up the legitimate authorities and not be intimidated even by the latest Russian threats. They've drawn a red line on the NATO decision at the summit to build a joint training center in Georgia, and the Secretary General the other day said, we're doing that because Georgia's a sovereign country and we've agreed to do it, and we will do it. But the first part is harder. The Russians are very clever, and we haven't talked so much about it today, but the disinformation is truly extraordinary. The way they are able to sow doubts even in our countries, as well as convince their own people that everything is squeaky clean. But in our own countries, they've made a lot of inroads in convincing people that the truth is somewhere in between as to what's really going on in eastern Ukraine, when in fact for me, it's quite clear what's going on. It's a quite black and white situation. But they're very clever in covering their tracks. They take down social media posts that go against their narrative, so that they still have sown doubts about who shot down Malaysian Airlines 17, even though it's pretty clear that the separatists had control of a Russian air defense missiles and shot down the plane, and then they drove it out of the country. It was all photographed and posted on social media, but they somehow still maintain doubt about that. So we have to do better, and we have to think harder about controversial subjects like releasing more intelligence. We always have to weigh the balance between protecting sources and methods and using intelligence as part of our public diplomacy. I think we've been a little bit too hesitant sometimes to expose what's really happening on the ground because of the well-founded concerns of our intelligence community, but it sometimes comes in conflict with good policy. But I think, fortunately, there's enough indiscipline on the Russian side that they begin to reveal the truth. Just yesterday, this famous guy, Strelkov, Igor Girkin, who was the Minister of Defense of the Donetsk People's Republic for some period as a Russian citizen, he published an article saying, the whole thing in the East was my doing. It would never have succeeded if we didn't bring in Russian forces, and the locals were incapable of doing this. So they're blowing their own cover story. And we have to exploit these and broadcast these things a bit more effectively.
Dr. Avineri?
I hate to add again, I agree with what has been said, but there is I'd like to add a skeptical issue here. And this has to do with the making Ukraine a coherent body politic. And it should be done, and I hope it's going to be done, and NATO support is very important. But one should also be a little bit skeptical about some of the things which are done by the Ukrainian government. When in order to maintain control over an eastern city, I'm not going to mention the city, the name starts with a D, you appoint then a local oligarch as a governor, and he is dispensing his money in order to get support for a good cause, and I'm for a good cause, but it's done in a way which is delegitimizing the government itself, or maybe delegitimate the government. And I hope that NATO will also use its democratic voice for transparency and for liberalism to give the sort of advice to the Ukrainian authorities, the legitimate Ukrainian authorities, that there are certain things which are perhaps a little bit problematic. It's just a footnote.
Although in Ukraine they do. The president does appoint the governors in Ukraine, so
the
process was legitimate, but I can agree with you on the particular choice.
It has to do with the cohesion of the body politic. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, we have a question here.
Roland Paris from the University of Ottawa. I have two questions for General Kelly about Iraq. It's very taken with what you were saying about your own experience with the Sunni tribes. And we know that mobilizing those tribes is central to the coalition strategy now to eject ISIS from Iraq. I was wondering what you think the prospects are of being able to win their support once again to take up arms to fight against ISIS, given what they might perceive as an abandonment by the United States and also skepticism about the Baghdad government. And my second question has to do with the debate taking place about whether U.S. or Western military forces will need to be deployed in frontline roles as advisors when this offensive begins. I'm wondering if you can comment on that, please.
But I had a unique experience in my last tour in Iraq. It was my third tour. I think I've got 37 or 8 months in the country all told. And when I went back in 2008, 2009, the awakening had certainly taken hold. Things were good. Violence was down. In Anbar province, the Sunni province, never, ever, ever was supposed to be, improved. The rest of in fact, Bremer or whoever said to me, the rest of Iraq will be a shining democracy eventually. And the Sunni region will always be a hotbed of murder and all this. The unique experience I had when I went back for my last tour was I was now making common cause with men, and we would talk about this in the various meetings. We used to have sheikh get-togethers. We'd call them shakedowns. Large groups of the sheikhs would come together. But most of the men in the room, I'd been trying to track down and either capture or kill in my previous 2 tours. And they had spent most of their time in my previous 2 tours trying to capture or kill me. So to sit there and to talk to them about why they decided to come over, if you will, and it had to do with Al-Qaeda, and it had to do with, interesting enough, they said, we understood we just couldn't beat you militarily. You just kept coming back day after day after day. Very interesting. The women in the province were getting the mothers were getting tired of going to their sons' burials. The young women were tired because their fathers were not allowing them to marry. We took advantage of, actually, the discontent among the female population and made appeals in terms of information operations to the women to go past the men. But long story short, when we formed 2 divisions in Anbar province. We intentionally made those divisions both Sunni and Shia, and they work together. And they're the best 2 divisions in the army, and they never broke. It's all about that kind of experience with the tribes. These tribes have stayed true to Baghdad more or less, even though Baghdad, frankly, Maliki didn't deserve that. They more or less stayed. For a couple of years after I came back, I'd still get emails from the tribal leaders, very, very, what do we do about this guy Maliki? But interesting enough, in the Anbar province region, they stayed more or less true to the Baghdad government for whatever reason, I don't know. But we encouraged them to do that. I think that the second part of your question had to do with abandonment. They don't have a choice right now. They've got to, the people that are being abused, murdered, tortured by ISIS, whether they're Kurds, they don't have much choice. So our coming back in there to assist them with, air power right now is having some toll on ISIS, but they're adjusting to that. At the end of the day, you in fact need boots on the ground. I don't know what color the boots need to be. They don't need to be American or Canadian or NATO boots necessarily, but they have to have boots on the ground. But there's nothing more important to these partner nations that we work with around the globe. There's nothing more important than a sense that there's a commitment, and I'll say from my country, there's a commitment from the United States that we'll stand with you, and just a sprinkling of U.S. uniforms or NATO uniforms amongst them. That's the sense of commitment they get. Again, the divisions we formed, the 40,000 Iraqi police units that we put together, we had American advisors throughout all of the units. And that level of commitment, just a sense that we're there with them, worked enormously in Iraq, to a very large degree in Afghanistan. Do we need to have boots on the ground? Yes. Someone's boots have to be on the ground. But at the end of the day, if it's important enough to, say, my country, if it's in my country's national interest, then we should put boots on the ground. If it's in but there's got to be boots on the ground.
Right. We have a question up here, and then I think we had someone back there.
Antonio Rodiles, I am from Cuba, political dissident, and my question is for General Kelly. How do you deal with a Cuba government that has been a government that violates the human rights for 55 years, and right now, for example, he's taking a huge advantage of the traffic of Cuban through Mexico, but at the same time, they sell themselves as a unique possibility to keep the stability in the region for Cubans. How do you deal with that?
Well, let me start by saying this. A lot of people talk about human rights. At least in my country's experience, the U.S. military does human rights. Everything I've done in my career, on the battlefield, or right now what I do now at Southern Command, everything I've done has begun and ended with human rights. The human rights records in Latin America in general, to use my current billet, where the United States military is able to work with militaries, and I'm restricted in some cases for a lot of different reasons, but the militaries that I've worked, the U.S. military has worked with in Latin America, the Caribbean, those militaries have improved enormously. In fact, if you do the independent polling of the Latin America or the Central American countries, Honduras, Guatemala, Belize, all of these countries, Colombia, Peru, with the exception of the Catholic Church, the #1 most admired and respected institution in the government institution is the military. They want to see their military on the streets. They want to see their military doing things in the countryside. Cuba, I'm restricted. I do not deal with Cuba. I wish I could, but I do not deal with Cuba. I also don't deal with any country that will violate human rights. I chastise various countries. I won't tell you which ones that I catch in a way not working the human rights angle the way they should. There's countries in Latin America I'm allowed to work with. There's countries, but I won't work with them until they start taking human rights seriously. And I go back to this almost miracle that is Colombia. Colombia exports security to various countries, working side by side with those countries, but they also export the lesson of human rights that they learned in their fight against the FARC, which is the single biggest human rights violator, I think, probably in the world, certainly in Latin America, and has been for 50 years. So I can't work with the Cuban military. I wish I could, because the track record of people like me working with human rights, questionable human rights militaries, is that they get better at what they do. But I take your point, and I wouldn't mind working with them, though. I think we could have a lot of positive influence on the human rights, if no other topic.
Ambassador Vershbow, briefly.
Yeah, I have absolutely no role with respect to Cuba, but I just wanted to make a point about NATO's role in training militaries, particularly as we try to expand that in the Middle East and North Africa in the coming years. One of the key goals is to institute Western standards. That includes Western standards of human rights. And this is an area where we very much need to partner with the good non-state actors, which we haven't paid any attention to, which were highlighted in the essay, the NGOs, who are, I don't think they're lost innocents. I think they're very courageous realists who put themselves in harm's way. And they're indispensable partners for NATO when we are in operations and when we also carry out some of these capacity building programs. We need to work together with NGOs to help us institute human rights practices. UN Resolution 1325, Women, Peace and Security, this is something where we've adopted it as a policy, but we need to work with NGOs, the good ones, the good non-state actors, to help us achieve our mission.
Thank you. And we have a question back here.
Okay. Nadia Shadlow, Smith Richardson Foundation. I have a question to any of the panelists, but there seem to have been two themes from this morning's event and then the current panel. The first, the ideological interconnectedness of these extremist groups, where they're not bound by borders. And the second being the importance of working with local forces to fight and help be at the forefront of fighting their own internal battles. Given that, what's the prognosis for Afghanistan, given the U.S. position to withdraw? Thank you.
Though the United States, I guess it was reported, is going to be extending, at least what the troops in Afghanistan will be doing. They'll be now freer to actually take on the Taliban and not simply be in a training role.
I should take that on. It's a NATO mission. First of all, we're not withdrawing now. We're drawing down to the end of the current ISAF mission, but we're going to be there for at least another 2 years with a train, advise, and assist mission. So we will continue to support, mentor, train, and finance the Afghan National Security Forces. I think the prospects are pretty good that they will be successful. They're already in the lead for all combat operations. They've had allied support, including air support and other enablers, but they're increasingly able to fly solo with only minimal support. I don't know the details of this latest U.S. decision. I only read the New York Times, but I think there's a recognition that the Taliban is still out there. They're degraded, they're not capable of holding territory, but they can still stage spectacular terrorist attacks from time to time. So that's why we're not turning on an on-off switch. We're going to stay engaged, continue to be with the Afghans, and even after the 2 years, we'll have some kind of long-term, enduring partnership with them that will continue to include, I'm sure, a strong defense capacity building program so that the ANSF can stay as effective as they are now.
Dr. Avineri,
Perhaps a footnote to this. It seems to me that there's one problem that sometimes is being overlooked in the West. And this is the issue of secularization or secularism in the Middle East. In the West, secularism or secularization is considered as part of the Enlightenment legacy, connected with liberalism, democracy, pluralism, individual rights. Not so, unfortunately, in the Middle East. The history of the Middle East in the last 80 or 100 years has been that secularization was introduced by reformers in a coercive way from above. The Shah in Iran, Atatürk in Turkey, in a less dramatic way, Ben Ali in Tunisia, Mubarak in Egypt, and even the Assad family in Syria. I mean, where the fact of the matter is that most of the Christians in Syria today support Assad, not because they like him or his dynasty, or because they believe in the future of Syria as a democratic country, but because they believe that under an Assad regime, their religious pluralism or their religious community will be somehow protected, which is not the case under ISIS. So we have to understand that some of the animus against authoritarian regimes in the Middle East comes not only from the fact that they are authoritarian, but they are also connected with secularism. And what we see in Iran, the Islamic Revolution, the AK party in Turkey, and similar developments in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood, are a response to a coerced secularization, which is sometimes to Western ears not acceptable because we think that secularization is connected with democracy. Not so in the Middle East. It just adds to the complexity and to my plea that when you look at the contending parties in the area, one has to understand that some of the political configurations are very different from the ones that we are used to in the West.
Thank you so much. And I know we could go on for probably another good hour, but we have run out of time. And so I think we've agreed this morning that this is not going to be an easy fight. It's not going to be over anytime soon. It is a generational battle, and the blood of tens of thousands of innocents and servicemen and women have been spilled. And I want to take this opportunity to thank in particular General Kelly for his service and for his sacrifice. His son died in Afghanistan in the fight in 2010. So thank you, General Kelly. Thank you to my wonderful panel. Thank you to my audience.